The Kremlin is losing sleep over a single conversation in Paris. This weapon will soon strike at the heart of Russia, and it will no longer depend on the schedules of Western supplies. A secret evacuation is being prepared in Crimea. While television broadcasts talk about total control, the peninsula is increasingly starting to resemble a territory where the authorities are preparing for events they prefer not to speak about. Darkness, outages, nervous decisions, and signs of panic are beginning to form a picture that Moscow would very much prefer not to show to Russians. Meanwhile, at the front, it's a true theater of the absurd. Russian propaganda continues to churn out victories faster than they can be checked on the map. But the louder the Kremlin celebrates another success, the more often it turns out that reality has prepared a completely different ending for the occupiers. Putin is losing everything. We'll talk about this right now. Hello, this is Ukraine Today. I'm Maria Farafonova, and here are the latest events. For the Kremlin, this could become one of the worst pieces of news, because it's not just about another delivery of Western weapons, but about Ukraine potentially gaining the ability to produce them independently. According to Defense Minister Mikhailo Fedorov, Kyiv is negotiating with France to obtain licenses for the production of Scalp cruise missiles. These are the very missiles that Russia fears not just in words but in practice, as they have repeatedly demonstrated their ability to strike important military targets far from the front line. If the negotiations are successful, Ukraine will receive not just another batch of weapons, but the opportunity to gradually increase its own production of high-precision long-range weaponry. Fedorov himself confirmed that negotiations are ongoing both with the French government and with the missile manufacturer. The process remains complicated due to issues of licensing and technology transfer. However, according to him, the process is already underway. In fact, this is about a strategic game changer. Partners are increasingly talking not only about supplying ready-made weapons, but also about giving Ukraine the capability to produce them. And this means that the Ukrainian defense industry could receive a new impetus for development and become significantly less dependent on the pace of external supplies. And if these negotiations are successful, the consequences could prove to be much more significant than any individual aid package. Because missiles can be delivered once, but technologies and domestic production are capable of serving the country's defense for years and helping to put pressure on the enemy. Meanwhile, the first days of the 40-day campaign announced by Zelensky are already yielding results that Moscow would prefer not to discuss. Explosions, transportation problems, infrastructure accidents, and new surprises for the Russian military machine are becoming a regular part of the agenda. So a rather uncomfortable question arises for the Kremlin: what will happen on the 10th, 20th, or 40th day? After all, while Putin talks about stability, a shockwave is already rolling from the occupied territories to the very heart of Russia's defense industry. And the first signals of this countdown for Moscow have turned out to be more than painful. The details are in our report. The countdown has begun. Putin has been given 40 days. After Volodymyr Zelensky's statement about a special operation to influence Russia, the Kremlin could hardly have expected such an explosive start. Because while Russian propaganda once again talks about reliable protection and complete control over the situation, explosions were thundering in Volgograd at one of the most important enterprises of the Russian military-industrial complex. And this was not just a warehouse with canned goods or an abandoned base on the outskirts. The Titan Barricades plant was hit, a true pride of the Russian defense industry. It was here that components were produced for the Iskander, Yars, Topol-M missile systems, and even for the Kremlin's much-publicized Oreshnik. In other words, we are talking about an enterprise that works directly for the Russian missile program. The most interesting thing is that the facility is located about 400 kilometers from the Ukrainian border. This creates a rather awkward situation for the Russian leadership. On the one hand, Putin assures the population that all threats are supposedly under control. On the other hand, Ukrainian strikes are already reaching enterprises that Moscow until recently considered to be deep in the rear. According to available information, the strike hit 3 production workshops. One of them has sustained serious damage. That was where the mechanical assembly unit was located, where key components for Russian missile systems were assembled. So, one of the sections that was hit is essential. Without it, the entire production chain starts operating much more slowly. The situation looks especially comical against the backdrop of the Kremlin's constant claims that sanctions don't work and that Russia's defense industry is only gaining momentum. It turned out that imported high-tech equipment was actively used in the production of Russian weapons. But now the problem isn't even about where the machines come from. The problem is that the workshop where they were located will have to be restored after a very unpleasant encounter with Ukrainian strike weapons. And here arises the main question: if this is only the beginning of that very 40-day campaign, what will happen next? After all, the Kremlin is already forced to patch holes on several fronts at once. Somewhere oil depots are burning, elsewhere airports are shutting down because of drones, and in other places there are problems with logistics and fuel. And now even strategic defense enterprises are starting to appear in emergency incident reports. The Russian system is gradually shifting into a mode of continuous crisis response. Not planning, not development, not preparing new offensives, but rather constantly putting out fires, both literally and figuratively. And every new strike adds yet another urgent problem for Moscow to solve. For the Kremlin, this is especially painful because such strikes destroy the main myth of Russian propaganda, the myth of absolute rear area security. Because when explosions are heard hundreds of kilometers from the border, when enterprises involved in the missile program come under attack and strategic factories are forced to halt operations, it becomes increasingly difficult to talk about stability. So while Moscow is busy counting the percentage of successfully intercepted targets, it seems that a completely different countdown has begun on the Ukrainian calendar, and each day of this campaign may bring new surprises for the Kremlin. And most importantly, it serves as a reminder to the Russian leadership of a simple truth: the longer the war drags on, the closer its consequences come to the very heart of Russia's military machine. And it seems that the problems facing Russia's defense industry are now starting not only from the skies but also within their own factories. While the Kremlin boasts about record-breaking drone production rates, events may have taken place in Alabuga itself, the main assembly center for Russian Shaheds, that are unlikely to leave Moscow pleased. According to the resistance movement, Ukrainian agents have been carrying out sabotage operations over the past month directly at the facility where strike drones for the Russian army are assembled. And we're not talking about loud explosions or fires. A much more dangerous scenario for the occupiers could be when problems begin after the drone has already left the factory gates. It is reported that dozens of surprises have been planted in the new batches of drones, which are capable of disabling the equipment during use. For the Russian military, this is essentially the worst possible scenario. After all, it's one thing when a drone fails to take off at the testing range, and quite another when a malfunction occurs during combat use, when it is assigned a specific mission and an outcome is expected. For years, the Kremlin has been assuring the public that Alabuga has become a true war conveyor belt capable of churning out drones by the thousands. But now a very unpleasant question arises: if saboteurs really managed to infiltrate one of the most important elements of the Russian war machine, just how reliable is this entire conveyor belt? And that's not all. According to information from the underground, data was also obtained about the personnel involved in the production of drones for the Russian army. And this means that the problems could go far beyond just a few defective products. After all, when the enemy obtains information about production chains and key personnel, the entire system comes under threat. While the Russian authorities are preparing to repel attacks from drones, missiles, and naval unmanned vehicles, problems may arise where they are least expected, right inside their own factories. And if previously Moscow feared strikes on defense enterprises, now they also have to worry about what is happening behind their fences. Very difficult times are coming for the Russian war machine. Some factories are suffering from attacks, others from logistical problems. And now there are reports that even finished products can bring unpleasant surprises to their own customers. And if this information is confirmed, it will be one of the most painful signals for the Kremlin. Problems are starting to accumulate not only at the front but also in the very heart of the Russian military-industrial complex. Crimea is beginning to plunge into darkness, and while Russian propaganda continues to talk about stability and full control, residents of occupied Sevastopol are being switched to a scheduled lifestyle: 3 hours with electricity, 3 hours without it. It seems that the Russian prosperity promised by the Kremlin is increasingly resembling survival under conditions of chronic breakdown. The occupation authorities explain the outages as a necessity to save the power system from overload. But the problem appears to be much more serious. After the strikes on the energy infrastructure and the Balaklava thermal power plant, even Russian officials are finding it increasingly difficult to pretend that nothing has happened. When hundreds of streets and entire settlements are left without power, it is no longer possible to conceal the scale of the problem. But electricity is only part of the problem. The entire logistics system of the peninsula is starting to fall apart. Traffic on the Crimean bridge is regularly halted due to the threat of drone attacks. After one of these closures, thousands of cars lined up near the bridge. Railway connections are also operating with restrictions, and some passengers are already being transferred to buses. This situation hits the tourist season especially hard, which Moscow has traditionally used as proof that supposedly everything is fine in Crimea. Just a few weeks ago, the occupation authorities were reporting hundreds of thousands of vacationers. Now their number has noticeably decreased. And while officials are counting the losses, businesses are starting to calculate their lost profits. The problems in Crimea do not end there. On the contrary, they are only growing. While rolling blackouts are being introduced in Sevastopol and the occupation authorities are trying to at least maintain the appearance of control, a much more alarming picture is already emerging behind the scenes. And the louder Moscow talks about stability, the more nervous the actions on the ground become. When in one part of the peninsula the power is turned off according to a schedule, and in another they are already preparing for scenarios that no one wants to speak about out loud, it becomes clear the situation in Crimea has clearly not gone according to the Kremlin's plan. And this is exactly where what sounds most uncomfortable for the occupation authorities begins. It seems that in Crimea they have started preparing for things that are forbidden to speak about openly. The details are in our report. It seems that in Crimea they have started preparing for things that are forbidden to speak about openly. While Russian officials continue to assure the population that the situation on the peninsula is fully under control, behind the scenes events are unfolding that look more like preparations for a major escape. According to Russian sources, a plan for the partial evacuation of the population and representatives of the occupation administration has already been developed in occupied Crimea. The most interesting part is that all of this is happening not in front of cameras or with loud statements, but under conditions of maximum secrecy. At the end of June, armed men began to arrive en masse at Crimean oil depots, effectively taking control of these facilities. Representatives of the owners were driven out, the enterprises were switched to a special operating mode, and any questions were explained away by closed orders from the occupation authorities. According to available information, this concerns the possible evacuation of up to 250,000 people. And this no longer looks like ordinary bureaucratic overcautiousness. That is the population of an entire large city. The only problem is that even the organizers themselves still do not understand where to put such a number of people if this plan is implemented. For years, the Kremlin has been selling Russians the image of Crimea as an eternally protected fortress, a resort supposedly far from any danger. But when the authorities begin secretly preparing transportation, fuel reserves, and evacuation scenarios, it creates the sense that the occupation administration's offices view the future much more anxiously than what is being said on television. And overall, it seems that Crimea has started living according to a scenario completely different from the one being painted in Moscow. While some officials are thinking about evacuation, others have suddenly encountered a different problem. The peninsula is simply running out of fuel. Moreover, the consequences are now affecting not only drivers. Due to the shortage of gasoline and diesel, farms are starting to shut down, which means that not just logistics or transportation are at risk, but also future harvests and the food security of the peninsula itself. The crisis hit Crimea precisely at the moment when the harvest campaign and vegetable planting are underway. Instead of working as usual, farmers are forced to travel hundreds of kilometers to the Krasnodar region and transport gasoline and diesel themselves in canisters. In fact, one of the key sectors of the peninsula's economy is shifting into survival mode. What angers farmers the most is not even the shortage itself, but the fact that the occupation authorities promised to provide fuel for agricultural producers. They promised but did not deliver. Meanwhile, the farms are left with loans, contracts, and obligations to supply products. Fulfilling them without fuel is becoming increasingly difficult. The consequences are already starting to hit Russians in their wallets. The cost of delivering feed and other products from Russian territory has increased several times over. Producers openly warn that all additional expenses will inevitably be included in the final price of goods. In other words, it is ordinary consumers who will have to pay for the fuel crisis. And it seems that the Crimean fuel crisis is no longer just a local problem of the peninsula, but a symptom of a much bigger issue. Because while farmers are searching for gasoline all over the Krasnodar region and the occupation authorities talk about temporary difficulties, in Russia itself they have started discussing a solution that just a few years ago would have seemed impossible. It seems that the fuel problems there have become so serious that the authorities are ready to pull out of the archives something they themselves abandoned more than 10 years ago. According to Russian media, the government is considering the possibility of bringing Euro 2 standard gasoline back to the market. The very same fuel whose sale was banned in Russia back in 2013. At that time, officials spoke about modernization, environmental standards, and technological development. And now it seems they have to carry out modernization in the opposite direction. Officially, everything is being explained by the need to support the market. In reality, after a series of strikes on oil refining infrastructure and regular disruptions in fuel production, the Kremlin is becoming increasingly desperate in its search for ways to cover the shortage. And while Russia used to boast about its modern oil refining capacities, now it is ready to put into circulation fuel that was already considered outdated in the last decade. Euro 2 allows for a significant simplification of gasoline production, less purification, fewer technological processes, and lower quality requirements. Simply put, if there isn't enough modern fuel, you can just lower the standards and declare the problem solved. However, there is one very inconvenient detail. Experts are openly warning that for a significant portion of modern cars, such fuel could pose a risk. In other words, while officials report that the situation has stabilized, car owners may face completely different consequences. The most interesting thing is that the Kremlin continues to act as if nothing out of the ordinary is happening. But when a country is simultaneously preparing evacuation scenarios, urgently searching for ways to close fuel gaps, and reverting to standards from a decade ago, it's very hard to call that a sign of confidence. On the contrary, it looks more like an attempt to hold the system together at any cost, in which problems are accumulating much faster than the official propaganda can come up with excuses for them. The Kremlin is still drawing up maps of major offensives, but a completely different story is unfolding at the front. Russian assault troops are increasingly being thrown into battle as a disposable resource, not to break through but to identify Ukrainian positions and exhaust FPV drone operators. According to journalist Dmytro Karpenko, Russian logistics are increasingly bogged down. In certain directions, there is already a shortage of fuel, which is causing planned assaults to be cancelled. The army that intended to seize new territories is now stumbling over a lack of gasoline. Yet another blow to the Kremlin's fantasies. The reality at the front is increasingly different from the reports Putin receives. The actual advance of Russian troops is often significantly less than what is reported to the top. That is why, in Moscow, they regularly capture new cities in words much faster than they can actually get close to them. The worst news for the Kremlin is that losses already exceed the rate of replenishment. In other words, the Russian army is starting to lose people faster than it can find new ones. And this means that even a new mobilization will not become an instrument of offense, but rather an attempt to urgently plug the holes that are spreading ever more rapidly along the front. The main problem for the Kremlin today is the collision of propaganda with reality. While Russian generals are drawing new successes on their maps and television promises yet another breakthrough every day, completely different numbers are accumulating at the front. Losses, logistical problems, and an ever-increasing cost for every kilometer. That is why Moscow is so desperately in need of beautiful images and loud victories for their reports. However, lately these triumphs increasingly exist only until they collide with reality. It seems that Russian propaganda is able to capture settlements much faster than the Russian army. Details in the report. Russia has already invented a new type of military victory. You run in, wave a flag in front of the camera, and you can report to Putin about a successful offensive. However, this time the show ended much sooner than the Russian propagandists had a chance to enjoy their own headlines. In the Zaporizhia direction, the occupiers solemnly announced the alleged capture of Novoselivka and Hulyai-Pilske, and propagandists had already started talking about another major breakthrough by the Russian army. However, this entire grand operation fit into a short video and a few loud headlines. The scenario was simple. A group of Russian assault troops ran to the outskirts of the settlements, unfurled the tricolor flag, recorded the necessary footage, and apparently were already getting ready to receive applause from their superiors. In the Moscow offices, they were probably already popping champagne, while the propaganda channels rushed to paint yet another historic victory. But once again, a small problem called reality arose between the video and the actual situation at the front. As soon as the cameras were turned off, a completely different story began. Ukrainian drones targeted the so-called liberators, and the loud, triumphant spectacle instantly turned into an operation to eliminate its participants. One of the occupiers, who just minutes earlier had posed with a flag for Russian news, ultimately ended up in Ukrainian captivity. This is already becoming the trademark style of the Russian army. First, they paint a picture of victory, and only after that do they face what is actually happening on the battlefield. While Kremlin propagandists count imaginary successes, Ukrainian soldiers are counting the very real results of their work. And the louder Moscow shouts about its triumphs, the more often it turns out that all this victory ended even before the propaganda piece finished editing. And this is far from the only case where the Russian authorities substitute reality with pretty fairy tales. Putin himself has personally joined in this process. During his latest statements, he painted an incredibly rosy picture of the Russian offensive. However, the facts and the maps of the front tell a different story. The Kremlin's master claimed that in the Lyman area, the occupiers only have 149 houses left to liberate out of more than 11,000. It sounds menacing, but the problem is that most of the city still remains under the control of the defense forces, while Russian assault groups only occasionally infiltrate certain areas in the eastern part of the city. In other words, the gap between Putin's words and reality is no smaller than the distance between the Kremlin's dreams and their actual results. The statements about Sloviansk and Sumy are no less interesting. The Kremlin claims that Russian troops are only 8 or 9 kilometers away from Sloviansk, although the actual distance is about twice as much. The situation with Sumy is no better. Putin talks about being 10 kilometers from the city, whereas in reality it's 17 to 20 kilometers, and the front line there has barely changed for months. The story about the alleged breakthrough of the impregnable Ukrainian defensive line near Dobropilya sounded especially fantastical. Putin even rushed to declare that beyond the city there are almost no Ukrainian fortifications. However, in reality, Russian units are still dozens of kilometers away from the lines he is talking about. It turns out that the Kremlin is already celebrating the overcoming of defenses that its troops haven't even reached yet. And the real gem was the statement about the almost completed encirclement of a large Ukrainian group near Rubtsi. According to Putin, only a few kilometers remain until the encirclement is complete. However, even a basic look at the map shows that there are still about 10 kilometers between the Russian positions and the area supposedly on the verge of encirclement. It seems the Russian leadership has long been fighting on two fronts at once. On one, the real front, where advances come at a tremendous cost and far from always yield results. On the other, the television front, where you can capture cities, encircle armies and break through defenses with a single wave of a pointer on the map. And while propaganda counts imaginary kilometers and non-existent victories, the front stubbornly keeps reminding the Kremlin that reality works a little differently. However, if we're talking about Russian fantasies, then the story with the flag in Zaporizhzhia or Putin's latest statements about a successful offensive are just a small episode in a much larger performance. In reality, the Kremlin has been painting a picture of victory over Donbas for the fourth year in a row, and every time the result is the same. Loud promises, various deadlines, and yet another postponement of the dates. The president of Ukraine also drew attention to this. According to Volodymyr Zelensky, since the beginning of the full-scale war, the Russian leadership has set a date for the complete capture of Donetsk region at least 15 times.
The political leadership of Russia is constantly obsessed with Donbas. They've had this delusion 15 times already, supposedly that they will completely capture Donbas. In 2022, the deadlines were set for March 31st, then May 9th, June 1st, September 15th, and December 31st. In 2023, Putin set two more deadlines for capturing Donbas by March 1st, and then when it didn't work out again, they postponed it to December 31st. In 2024, there are two such deadlines again. In 2025, when the Russians tried to convince President Trump that Ukraine would supposedly fall, there were already three deadlines, by September 1st, by December 1st, and by December 25th.
After such a list, it's already hard to understand what exactly is considered the main military operation in Russia. Is it the assaults on the front line or the regular postponement of deadlines? It seems the only thing the occupiers have managed to take full control of over these years is their own calendar. They've tried to capture Donbas so many times that by now they should have reached not only Kramatorsk but even Mars. But every time, stubborn reality shattered the Kremlin's presentations. It's especially amusing that even in 2026 this spectacle continues. At first, Moscow dreamed of resolving the Donetsk issue by March 31st. Then the deadline was quietly pushed back to September 1st. Now the new target is December 31st. And you can almost be certain that if nothing changes, at the end of the year, Russian propaganda will solemnly announce yet another very close victory, which will simply have to be postponed a little longer.
If Russia does not end its war, then they will have to postpone this final deadline once again. If Putin wants to sacrifice another million of his soldiers to keep banging against this wall, then the million Russians who have not yet been mobilized into the Russian army and are still arguing in lines for gasoline should think about what awaits them next.
And here arises the main question. If in 4.5 years of war, the Kremlin has already almost captured Donbas 15 times, hasn't this whole story turned into the biggest series of unfulfilled promises in modern military history? Because while Russian officials draw new arrows on maps and invent new dates for their victories, the front stubbornly keeps reminding them of one unpleasant thing. The gap between television and reality is growing ever wider. And what do you think about the latest events? Share your thoughts in the comments, leave a like, and subscribe so you don't miss the main news. See you in the next episode!